All right, in this lecture, we're going to get into talking a little bit more about the brain. So, the brain is obviously extremely complicated, very fascinating. If you are interested in this stuff, we're just going to be talking about it extremely briefly. We're really just scratching the surface. But if this stuff is of interest to you, one thing you might want to consider is we have an awesome health psychology major and also health psychology minor here at MCPHS. So if you're interested in learning more about the brain, we have tons more courses that will allow you to go a lot more in depth than what we have time for in Bio 152. But I think the brain is very fascinating, and I hope you do too. So I wanted to just sort of talk about some of the major parts of the brain. Obviously, the brain is really complicated, but you can divide it up into four major areas. So you have, first of all, when we think about the brain, I think we often sort of think first about the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is going to be the site of all of the conscious activity that happens in our brain. So everything that we are aware of happening in our brain is happening at least to some extent in the cerebrum. So all of our thought, perception, decision making, what we really kind of think of as brain activity is all happening in the cerebrum. There is also a structure called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, I'll talk more about in a minute, but it is involved in motor patterning. So it's involved in movements or activities that involve complicated patterns of muscle coordination. So things like playing an instrument or even just writing with a pen or speaking, right? So you have to, in order to produce speech, move the muscles of your mouth and your tongue in a very precise way. So those patterns are things that we have to learn when we're babies. And now it's very easy, right? You don't really have to think about how I'm going to move my mouth to say these words, right? It happens automatically because those patterns are encoded in your cerebellum. All right, another part of the brain is going to be what's called the brainstem. So the brainstem is kind of, it's the most evolutionarily ancient part of the brain. So it's conserved across many species that have much more primitive brains than we do. And the brainstem is involved in coordinating very basic life-sustaining functions. So the brainstem is going to control things like your breathing rate. It's going to control your ability to swallow, your heart rate. It's going to control things like vomiting and digestion. So the brainstem is located at it gets its name from the fact that it's at the base of the brain, and it's kind of also as important as a connection between the brain and the spinal cord. So it's going to control a lot. It's going to contain a lot of what are called tracts. So these are going to be groups of myelinated axons that are going to connect the brain and the spinal cord. So it's kind of an important communication point between the brain and the rest of the nervous system. And then finally, I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of the brain, but there's a structure called the diencephalon, which is going to contain some things that we've actually already talked about, including the hypothalamus, which we talked about being very important for many aspects of homeostasis. We also talked about the fact that the hypothalamus is going to control the release of a lot of hormones in your body. It's also going to control a structure called the thalamus, which is important for what's called sensory gating. So we'll talk a little bit more about sensory gating next week, but that refers to the fact that not everything that you're perceiving in your body is going to actually get sent as a message to your brain. So if you're watching this and you're sitting in a chair, right? So hopefully your focus is on the fact that I am speaking and that you're trying to interpret and remember what I'm saying. But you're actually receiving a lot of other sensory information from your environment in addition to just the sound of my voice, right? There might be background noises. There might be light coming from a certain direction. There might be the feeling of the chair that you're sitting on pushing up against your butt, right? And you're probably not thinking about those things. Maybe you are now that I just drew your attention to them, but you probably weren't thinking about what it feels like to sit in your chair before I mentioned that. And that's because your thalamus is playing the important role of deciding what's the most important information that we need to focus on right now. Is it the fact that we're sitting in a chair, even though we've been sitting in this chair for 30 minutes, or is it Professor Wade talking and giving us important information? So your thalamus is really important in terms of what you're paying attention to at a given time. So the reason why I think the diencephalon is really interesting is because it's kind of like a bridge between the cerebrum, the conscious part of your brain, and the other parts of your brain that are not involved in conscious thought. So the diencephalon has sort of some consciousness about it. I like to think of it as sort of being like your subconscious. So it's things that you're sort of aware of, but maybe not explicitly as ideas in the cerebral part of your brain. Okay, so this is a picture showing you some of these structures that I just talked about. So the cerebrum is going to consist of the outside of the brain. The cerebellum, I think, always looks kind of like a cabbage. You can see it's quite a large structure, so we have a lot of area dedicated to motor patterning. The brainstem is going to be this area down here. You can see it literally looks like a stem on the brain. And then the diencephalon is going to be deep within the brain and is going to consist of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so I mentioned before motor patterning is being really important, and I always like to use this opportunity to show this very cute video of my son when he was first learning to walk. This is actually the first video I ever took of him walking independently. And I put it up here, obviously, because it's very cute, but I think it's kind of instructive to look at a toddler learning to walk when we think about the cerebellum, because we don't really think about the fact that, you know, when you're walking, it's all these decisions you're having to make about how to balance your body weight on one foot and then the other foot. So you can really see the effort when you look at a toddler learning to walk for the first time. You can see that he has to sort of adjust his balance a couple times in order to avoid falling over. Now, of course, he walks just fine. He doesn't have to do that anymore because his cerebellum has developed these automated patterns for responding to things like, you know, what if you trip on something, right? So your cerebellum helps you to develop the correct pattern of muscle contraction in order to right yourself again. So the cerebellum is actually very important for just walking, other kinds of basic patterns of motor function. All right, next thing I wanted to talk about are the ventricles of the brain. So I mentioned in the last lecture that you have these ependymal cells that are going to help to circulate cerebrospinal fluid. So within the brain, you're going to have cerebrospinal fluid going around the outside of the brain. So you have CSF between the brain and the skull, but you also have these pockets called ventricles within the brain that are also going to contain CSF. So as I mentioned, the CSF is going to be important for helping substances to circulate within the central nervous system. It also plays a role in helping to cushion your brain and spinal cord within the skull and within the vertebrae. The cerebrospinal fluid is actually made within these ventricles in the brain. And these ventricles, you have 4 of them. So you have what are called the lateral ventricles. So that's this one and this one. Those are the first and second ventricles. Then you have what's called the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. All of these ventricles are connected to each other, and they are also going to be connected through the fourth ventricle with the CSF that goes around the outside of the brain and the outside of the spinal cord. So just while we're talking about cerebrospinal fluid, one thing that happens not super infrequently in newborn babies is that they can be born with what's called hydrocephalus, which is also referred to as water on the brain. So what happens here is when a fetus overproduces cerebrospinal fluid, what will happen is because fetuses have very soft skulls and they have gaps between the plates of their skull, that the CSF is actually going to cause the shape of the head to change. So this is a baby born with CSF, and obviously it has an abnormal head shape. Luckily, this is quite treatable. So sometimes it requires surgery, sometimes it requires wearing a helmet, but the skull can often be induced to grow into a more typical pattern. So oftentimes babies who are born with CSF, they grow up and you could never tell anything was wrong with them. In some cases, the CSF can put enough pressure on the brain that it can cause damage to the brain, but often kids who have hydrocephalus do just fine with it. If you started to overproduce CSF, this would not happen to you because your skull is more rigid and it's attached, the different bones are attached to each other, so you don't have the space for them to expand and change the shape of your head. So this only happens in babies before they're born. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit about structures, about strategies that we can use to look inside the brain. So obviously a lot of what we know about the brain comes from dissecting the brains of people who are deceased. But in recent years, there's actually been a lot of progress made in being able to measure changes in brain activity in people who are awake and alert, which is really useful for understanding what different parts of the brain do. So there's two techniques I'm going to talk about here for measuring brain activity in alert subjects. The first one is called PET scanning. We actually mentioned this earlier on, I think in Bio 151. So in PET scanning, what happens is you inject radioactive glucose and then you can detect the radioactivity in the body. So this is a good way of determining where cells are using a lot of energy. So the more glucose that a cell is using, the brighter it's going to appear in the PET scan. So you can use this in response to challenging somebody to do a task, and you can see basically where the glucose goes in the brain to see which brain areas are working the hardest. What's shown in this picture is what's called an fMRI, which stands for functional MRI. So this is a way of using an MRI machine, a magnetic imaging machine, to measure changes in blood flow in the brain. So you can see here that in this experiment, researchers are using it to measure where blood flows when somebody's listening to happy music versus listening to sad music. So this is another way, minimally invasive, doesn't involve the same level of you don't have to inject something in somebody, but you can monitor brain activity in somebody who is awake and alert. All right, I did want to also talk a little bit about a collection of structures that are partly in the diencephalon and partly in the cerebrum called the limbic system. So the limbic system is going to contain the hypothalamus and thalamus, both of which are in the diencephalon, but it's also going to contain structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are involved in memory. And it's going to be connected to the olfactory bulb, which is part of the sensory processing process for smells. So all of these structures go together. They're involved in forming memories, but also they're involved in regulating emotions. So you have probably noticed before that smell can really evoke memories and emotions for us, right? Maybe more so than any other sense, right? I'm sure you've experienced going somewhere and you smell something and like you get this rush of nostalgia or maybe even a bad memory associated with it. So the reason for this is that there's strong anatomical connections between our sense of smell, our regulation of our emotions and our perceptions, and our sense of memory. So that's why when something like a traumatic experience or a very happy experience happens to you, you're more likely to commit that to memory because of this connection between the thalamus and hypothalamus and these memory structures of the amygdala and hippocampus. And oftentimes those memories can be associated with smell because of the involvement of the olfactory bulb.